do you think? What do these two pieces have in common? Welcome back to Note and Compass. I'm Peter Nelson, and today we're going to discuss these two custom projects that I finished recently this year. The big takeaways that I want for you to know today are: how does the custom jewelry process look? What do you need to expect? And what are the advantages and disadvantages of the lost wax casting method? So let's begin at the beginning. Custom work. These are pieces that were made specifically for clients of mine. The first one is an infinity band in 18 karat rose gold and sapphire. And this is for the wife of a childhood friend of mine. They saw the infinity bands that I had made previously, and because they love sapphire, they wanted one of their own. But the pieces that I had available didn't fit their finger size. So some of you are probably asking, Peter, why didn't you just take one of the other ones that you had and resize it? If it's only a small distance, surely that should be possible. And maybe it's possible, but when you've got stones going around the entirety of the ring, every time you resize it, the outer dimensions of that circle change. And that means that the claws that are holding in each of those stones also potentially loosen or tighten. So they can either break stones or have many stones fall out. And I'm not about that business. I've already done the work once, I'm not doing it again. I would rather just remake the ring. And it makes this new piece unique. So as I mentioned in the introduction, I want you to have some understanding of the lost wax method. Both of these projects used the lost wax method. So in the latter part of 2024, when I got back to Bangkok and I was getting back into my studio setup, I had limited tools available to me at that moment, and certainly limited studio space. So in order to get going on that project right away, the fastest way for me to do that was to do a lost wax casting. So one of the major advantages of lost wax is that you can cut down on time. It's a lot easier to file and sculpt and shape wax than it is metal. If I were to hand fabricate, starting only with gold, doing all of the work in gold, the speed of filing and cutting on gold is a lot slower than wax. In addition, everything that I take off of wax is effectively no money. Everything that I take off of gold either becomes dust or it disappears into the ether. Every time I wash my hands, if I've got gold dust on that, that becomes a non-recoverable loss for me. In larger factories where they've got big turnover, they oftentimes even have a device at the bottom of their sinks so that they can catch some of that dust as it washes off of your hands. If gold is heavier, it sinks to the bottom, typically. Finer particles can still float. And let's just say when you're working with larger volume, that adds up very quickly. Especially when gold is at historic prices like it is now. It has never been this expensive before in history. So I did the initial carving of this ring to size, or slightly smaller then, so I had some wiggle room, in wax and then got it cast. And as you can see by the final casting, this is very rough. Visually, it's a lot more difficult to appraise wax, especially dark wax, than it is to appraise metal. So I knew that the fastest thing for me to do would be to sculpt it roughly, leave plenty of room for me to have space. Yes, that increases my cost, but I can also guarantee a better finished product. So I took that rough casting, file and sculpt, cut, drill, making sure that I keep as much of that dust as possible, so that when I get enough of that dust and off-cuttings of gold, I can send it in and have it refined, either retrieving my money or have pure gold sent back to me. But that's further down the road. And those are assets I can't pay my bills with. Rent? And some of you that are particularly sharp are probably saying, Peter, why don't you just use the mold from the previous infinity rings, size that up, you'll still have plenty of space, you don't have to worry about breaking stones, etc., and that would be a very clever idea, except I destroyed that mold. Now that was done intentionally because I don't want to be doing large amounts of repeatable projects that are just the same. While it might be a decent business model, frankly it's boring for me, and I'm not interested in diluting value. As far as I'm concerned, the rarer things are, the more valuable they are. So if I only ever do 5 or 6, then we have to look at the prices of those things differently. If you have got tens of thousands of them, then how do we think about the value of those commodities? They are just commodities. Even if we say, well, this one's shaped differently than that one, nobody cares. It's highly available. So that brings us to one of the advantages and disadvantages of lost wax casting. If you get a mold, such as this one, a silicone mold, you could just inject wax into this, put it on a tree, and have hundreds or thousands of the same piece of jewelry or same components made. Whatever metal you want. You want silver? You want 14K? You want 9K? You want 18K? In Bangkok, where this is done regularly, I can have hundreds of the same piece tomorrow. All I have to do is pull out money. And so if you're flicking around on social media and you see people talking about handcrafted jewelry, and they're selling hundreds of those pieces, then their handcrafted jewelry is not handcrafted in the same way that I'm discussing. If you dig into their marketing materials, you'll see that they start with lost wax casting. That's the only way that they can get identical or highly similar pieces of jewelry in a large enough volume to keep it cheap enough to sell for a couple of bucks as a trinket for people to enjoy. I have nothing against trinkets for people to enjoy, but I will make a point of climbing the hill and standing on it to say that there's a huge difference between a commodity that's pumped out by the hundreds and thousands as opposed to something that is unique and difficult to replicate. And that's why I like to put my hands on the piece of jewelry as much as possible, and I keep pushing myself to learn skills that are hard to replicate. I enjoy it more, and it also makes the final piece more valuable. Even if the price point is not as high, it is a unique thing. So if I wanted to make hundreds of the same thing, then yes, having a mold such as this silicone mold would be the way to go. The reason that I have this one right here is because this is a blank. It's basically just a form. Instead of having large sheets of silver or gold or whatever, I can get my general form ready. I can have a run of these cast and clean up by local technicians here in Bangkok, and then I can spend my time doing what I believe is adding value to the piece, engraving and stone setting. Each of these will be in the same shape, but the actual meaning of the piece will come along with the engraving and the variable stone setting. Where do I want to put the stones? What kind of motif do I want to make? Each one of those pieces will be different. But because we start here, I can go ahead and carve off several hours of my time, which not only makes it more convenient for me, but it also makes it less expensive for everyone else. So there's a time and a place for it, just like using curse words. So anyhow, on the 18K rose gold and sapphire ring, I sculpted it to the final size and proportions that I wanted, something to make it unique and more beautiful. Set the stones, polished it up, and woo, we're done. And because I did it in lost wax, it was a lot less expensive and easier to do in a limited environment, especially before I had my setup fully completed. The second piece of custom jewelry that I made was a spessartite and 14K white gold pendant, as well as a 14K white gold ear stud. The client emailed me at gemshepherd.com saying that they also love spessartite, which I talk about a lot over on Gemology for Schmucks, and I was very happy to hear that, because I also love spessartite. That's why I talk about it so much. So once we talked through their idea of what they were interested in, as well as their budget range that they were comfortable with, I presented my client with a selection of stones to choose from. We chose the one that fit their idea best, as well as their price range. And then we came to the first step in custom jewelry. That conversation, we have to decide first on the stone that fits the project. Because metal, I can buy anytime, at least at this stage in history. In other periods of history, sometimes the metals have been controlled. During the World War, platinum, which was used extensively during the Art Deco period leading up to the World War, was made a strategic metal, and so it was no longer available to be used in jewelry, at least legally. And that is when white gold was invented. People these days think that white gold has always been around, but it really has not. If you don't want to be working in silver, but you want white, platinum is a much brighter metal to be working with. White gold is not white, which you'll see a little bit later in this video. Fundamentally, the amount of gold, which is very yellow, that's in the alloys that we use for white gold is still dominant. So that means that a significant amount of that yellowness can be expected to be there. So in order to have a truly white piece of jewelry, we have to plate it, which I'll talk about that process a little bit later in this video. So once the client purchased the spessartite that suited their needs, then we moved on to the design phase. Design we can take as long as we want. So my client did something that makes me very happy, which is to come to me with some pictures of things that they like. We can take elements from what they like and create something new. So they wanted a more simple bar-style pendant and a stud earring. So I needed to coordinate these two pieces of spessartite so they had similar colors. Even though spessartite is always orange in some capacity, there's different hues and definitely different tones, different depths of color. Working together on that design, I looked at the pictures that my client had. I made a technical drawing with millimeters, which also helps me to get an idea of what the cost of the piece will be. And then I add some additional suggestions. Rather than just have a plain bar, why not put some engraving on there? So I sent the client some samples of my engraving, which you'll also see on this channel, and they selected a pattern that they enjoyed. They liked the sculpted laurel leaf, and they asked if I could make it a little bit less dense. So I separated it out. I had to practice that new design. It's not one that I'd practiced before. So in order to elongate it and make the leaves a little bit more spaced, I went back to the old copper practice plates until it was at a point where I was satisfied with its quality. So then we came to the next stage. We have our stone bought, we've agreed on our design, and we're ready to start production. Now we have to put down a materials deposit. In order to get the casting done, it takes money. So once we agree on the design, the deposit is to pay for those initial materials. The balance of the project's fee will come at the end right before shipping. So once we've got that material deposit in place, I carve out the wax, once again for speed and cost management, and get that cast in 14 karat white gold. A couple of days in Bangkok is all you need. So I get my casting back, clean it up, lots and lots of filing, again, making sure I keep my dust where I can find it. And that brings us to one of the other disadvantages of lost wax casting. In order to make the prongs to hold in the stone, there are a few methods in lost wax, but I don't think they're anywhere near as attractive nor as durable as using traditional pulled wire prongs. So what I did was I took the initial wax carving and I carved in the seats where the wires are going to sit in. Then I used separate wire that we had drawn before, and I made those prongs manually. And sometimes we really have to Frankenstein it in there. These types of clip-like contraptions are what we have to do sometimes in order to keep the wire in place long enough so that we can solder it in place. And the advantage of this is when you draw wire, it compacts the material a lot more. When you cast metal, it's basically like a sponge. There's pockets. And this white gold actually showed that to a nightmarish degree. Because when you go to polish this cast metal, polishing is basically wearing off fine layers of the metal. And so when it gets to those pockets in there, just like in that sponge-like matrix, those become holes. So instead of being a completely flat plane, especially when you're under a microscope, you see those pock marks show up. Now, if you're just holding it a normal wearing distance for jewelry, if anybody's up this close to your jewelry, you should be hitting them. That's not legal advice, just my personal opinion. But as somebody who wants to do the best job possible, it was infuriating to polish white gold because I knew that no matter how hard I tried, I would never get it to the level that I wanted to get it because of the nature of cast metal. Every alloy has its own properties, but cast metal in general is going to have more porosity to it. So now I understand why one of my previous employers said that white gold is against his religion. He works in high carat yellow gold or he works in platinum. If you want white gold, you're not his client. Where's the juice getting sent around? I want some of this communion. And so taking some of the lessons that I learned from that class ring resurrection, the 2 rings that I made out of that one ugly one, I got the pendant as close to finished as possible, prongs on and everything, set the stone, give it a polish before I went to engraving. And engraving in white gold was also very unpleasant. White gold doesn't feel the same way that high carat gold does. Something about the alloy that is necessary to make this color makes the properties of 14K white gold in particular very unpleasant. It's very tough to pull. Some people say it's like spring steel. And then when you go to engrave it, it's very slippy and the outside edges are not as crisp. Whereas high carat yellow gold or copper or even silver feel a little bit gummy. When you cut through white gold and sculpt it, it resists the blade and then the outside edges of it basically crack, kind of like aluminum. So I had to resharpen my graver more often than usual because the outside edges of the graver were chipping off, which isn't just unpleasant, but it also affects how well you can sculpt with the graver. Sometimes you slip off in a direction that you don't want to go. And when a large part of the pendant is just polished metal, sometimes you make mistakes that are really hard to get rid of. I believe the word for that feeling is chagrin. But we got there, and I ended up having a great piece that I could be proud of and that my client could rejoice in wearing, which is what they told me in their email once they received it. Not a direct quote. This is the direct quote. But once the engraving was done, before I could ship, I had one last step, and that is plating. So white gold, in order to keep it white, we have to plate it. So basically what that means is that you take the piece of jewelry, and by dipping it into a series of electrical baths, you get the metal that is suspended in that solution to stick to the outer layer of the piece of jewelry. This is something that we did on one of the days at New Approach School for Jewelers this past year. Doesn't take much time, and it is a very thin layer of metal, but it's enough to give you a large visual. So instead of being that kind of whitish yellow that white gold actually is, that rhodium plating, which is a platinum group metal, there's a series of metals that are all part of the platinum group. It's not just platinum, the element itself. Platinum, palladium, ruthenium, iridium, rhodium. And just like with other platinum group metals, it is incredibly resistant to any kind of chemical reaction. So instead of oxidizing in the air and pollution, like you would see with silver, it just remains a stark white. But as you wear the ring and touch it, that layer is going to wear off. So those of you that are getting white gold jewelry, especially for wedding bands that you're wearing every day and touching and being so fond of, you're going to notice that it becomes more yellow much more frequently. so you'll need to get it replated. When I was in Japan last year, when I went around to jewelry stores seeing what they had available, what was common, what was popular, you don't really see much white gold once you get into higher carat pieces. They just go straight for platinum. And I think it's exactly because of this. Something that requires high maintenance and perhaps is even considered deceitful, such as this rhodium plating, doesn't take much favor with the Japanese. They'd rather go for platinum. And in fact, they're one of the higher consumers of platinum worldwide. And frankly, platinum's just more awesome. And furthermore, at this time in history when people are scare buying gold because of the disturbances in the force, there has never been a better time to start looking towards platinum projects. The price of platinum has not changed anywhere near as much as the price of gold has. Gold is now at a historic high and platinum is arguably at a historic low. But one of the key differences is that not everybody understands platinum. The general public trusts silver and gold, but don't know anything about platinum. So it is my opinion that now is a great time to get into platinum. Not every jeweler knows how to work with it. There are different rules to work in platinum. But once you understand them, it's a whole new world. Not to mention because it's so dense, it survives a lot longer than gold. How about that for heritage? So if you, like these other clients of mine, are interested in colored stone jewelry, please head over to gemshepherd.com where you can contact me directly. Otherwise, there's my mailing list. Certain pieces, such as this pendant that I finished this past week, will be available in that mailing list before it will be available anywhere else. They get first dibs. So if you are interested in opportunities that not everybody gets to see, then please get on that list. Otherwise, leave me a comment down below, hit like, hit subscribe, tell all your friends about me. Until next time, bye-bye.